Welcome back to educator.com. Today we're going to go over amendments number 20 to amendments number 27 to round out all the amendments in the Constitution. So let's get started. In today's lesson overview, we're just going to go over these 20 amendments. There's not a lot of court cases I'm going to use to go over it. Just basically the whole point of it is to see how the Constitution has changed, and this lesson overview is just a brief summary of what these amendments, what changes the amendments have brought to the Constitution. So the 20th Amendment dealt with a change in inauguration, at least for the president, to January 20th. The 21st Amendment was repealing of the 18th Amendment. The 22nd Amendment limits a president to 2 terms. Amendment 23, D.C. residents now vote in presidential elections. Amendment 24 makes illegal poll taxes. Amendment 25 deals with presidential succession, so we'll go over some of the key elements that was changed in the Constitution. Amendment 26 deals with 18-year-olds having the right to vote. And Amendment 27, very interesting story with that, deals with congressional pay. So that's this lesson overview. So let's go straight into Amendment 20 here. So what I did was, again, I put in some cases the entire amendment. Some cases where the amendment was a little bit too long, I just reprinted the most relevant section. So let's talk about Amendment 21 to the Constitution. Or actually, this is this is not Amendment 21. This is Amendment 20 to the Constitution. So this is Amendment 20 to the U.S. Constitution. Section 1 says that the terms of the president and vice president shall end at noon on the 20th day of January, and the terms of senators and representatives at noon on the 3rd day of January of the years in which such terms would have ended if this article had not been ratified, and the terms of their successors shall then begin. So this is Section 1 here. The 2 main points in this is the 20th day of January, which is where the new president becomes inaugurated, and noon on the 3rd day of January for the senators and representatives. So before the inauguration was in March, and the Congress basically was able to have a longer term through March, and a lot of that had to do with the times. There was a longer period required for a transition, and so this amendment basically shortened it here. And it was ratified. This amendment was ratified in January 1933. And what it did is it shortened the lame duck status of both the president and Congress. In earlier times, a long period of time was necessary for the long trek to Washington, D.C., but such time is now unnecessary. So if you take a look at this 20th Amendment, it's basically an amendment that kind of took into account that, we're living in the 20th century now, and there's really no need for the president to have this long of a transition period. It became kind of more of a practical matter, because you had, President Roosevelt, you had President Roosevelt winning the election in 1932, and it allowed for him to be, not have to worry about, this length of change, particularly, he got reelected for several terms, but, and then Truman took over. But later on, can you imagine after Kennedy's election, Johnson takes over and Nixon wins the election in 1968, the amount of time that President Johnson in 1968 would have been a lame duck would have been a really long time. So this is more of a modern convenience, so to speak, because it really no longer took a long period of adjustment. The new president didn't really have to take a long time to go to the Capitol. In modern times, quick flight to Washington, D.C., and you're in the nation's capital. You don't have to brave out harsh winter storms to trek to the Capitol 5 miles going uphill. That just didn't take place. A good mnemonic here with the 20th Amendment 20th Amendment has to do with the 20th of January. So when you think of the 20th Amendment, think of the 20th of January as being the day of inauguration. Now, if the 20th lands on a Sunday, then they'll make adjustments, or they'll have the ceremony itself will be maybe on the 21st, and there'll be a private ceremony. So that's actually what happened with Obama's inauguration, where he was at least for 2012, it landed on a Sunday, the 20th. So the following day, he was publicly he publicly retook the oath of office, but in a private ceremony, he took the oath of office. So sometimes you have that situation taking place. And again, just to give you an idea with the 21st Amendment, this is something I already mentioned before with the 18th Amendment, but the 18th Amendment and the 21st Amendment are somewhat related here. Whereas the 18th Amendment made illegal prohibition in terms of alcohol, the 21st Amendment simply repealed the 18th Amendment. So you had a repeal of the 18th Amendment. So what you want to use to memorize the 21st Amendment is that the 18th Amendment, you think you're 18 years old and you think you're an adult, but you're really not. So chances are, if you're watching this, if you're a high school senior, you're 18 years old, you think you're an adult, but you can't buy alcohol. And that's what the 18th Amendment represents. You're 18 years old. 18th Amendment prohibits alcohol in terms of its sale and distribution. The 21st Amendment basically repeals that 18th Amendment, and so you are a full-grown adult. So again, maybe an easy mnemonic to memorize what the 18th and 21st Amendment are. So let's go straight to the 22nd Amendment here. The 22nd Amendment, it's kind of a longer one, so I basically didn't have the entire parts, but here's the first section here. No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of the president more than once. And we'll discuss this a little bit later. This actually, the fact that the wording was in here kind of implied that you weren't sure if the vice president who took over upon a president's death was either president or acting president. So that's why the term "or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term." That's why that's included. And we'll go over how the 25th Amendment basically made this unambiguous here. But this article shall not apply to any person holding the office of president when this article was proposed to Congress. So whoever was president at that time, which I'll go over when it was ratified, it didn't apply to them. Just to, it would seem to be a little bit unfair if that would have been the case. And shall not prevent any person who may be holding the office of president or acting as president during the term which this article becomes operative from holding the office of president or acting as president during the remainder of the term. So this was ratified in February 1951. Now, in 1951, if you want to take a look back at presidential histories, remember this is referred to as the FDR Amendment because FDR was elected to 4 terms, so he served from 1933 to 1945. Truman served out the rest of his term when he passed away in 1945. So Truman served from 1945 to 1949. So this amendment got passed during Truman's presidency. So even though Truman served more than FDR's more than half of FDR's term, and he was therefore elected only once, he could have ran for a 3rd term, but it basically would have gone against the spirit of the rule of this 2-term precedent that had been established prior to. So again, constitutionally, Harry Truman was capable of running for a 3rd term, but again, he chose not to do so. George Washington served only 2 terms, and he set a precedent for Thomas Jefferson to follow. Now, who actually set the precedent? Well, I mean, did George Washington set this precedent so that all other presidents to follow would just follow this term? You can argue that he did. Again, George Washington was he didn't really express a lot of his own private thoughts in his official correspondence. He was very straight and to the point. So you can argue that maybe he was thinking about posterity when he ran, when he was president only for 8 years. But the idea that maybe, George Washington, a logical argument was that he was just tired and old and he wanted to retire back to Mount Vernon. So that's one plausible argument. Whereas Thomas Jefferson, he was more the person maybe responsible for following this precedent of 2 terms. So while George Washington was the one that did first serve 2 terms, it was Thomas Jefferson that more established that precedent. If he had continued, if he had ran for that 3rd term, it's quite possible that we'd be talking about a 3-term tradition rather than a 2-term tradition today. So if you had to give credit to one person, it would probably be Thomas Jefferson more so than George Washington. Again, some historians might disagree with my assessment here, but again, that's what we're going to go with right now. Again, few presidents prior to Franklin Roosevelt sought out a 3rd term of office. There actually have been presidents that did. Ulysses S. Grant, he did, but he lost the bid to a challenger when he tried to run for a 3rd term in 1876. Grover Cleveland, our only president to have served non-consecutive terms, he lost out in his bid to win the presidency. Woodrow Wilson also, he served 2 terms, but he had health issues, and the most notable probably was Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt actually became president in 1901 when William McKinley was assassinated. So he served he was our youngest president. John F. Kennedy was our youngest elected president, but Theodore Roosevelt, he served out the remainder of McKinley's term, and in 1904 he ran for re-election. And in 1908, basically he bowed out to let William Howard Taft become the Republican nominee. He was kind of his hand-selected appointee. But in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt tried to run for the Republican nomination. He lost out on the Republican nomination, and so he ran again as a 3rd-party candidate, as the Bull Moose candidate, and basically handed the presidency to Woodrow Wilson. So, the 2-term precedent was something that was kind of informally followed, but, with FDR, running for the 3rd time, there was nothing unconstitutional about it, and the American people voted him into office. So there was no controversy with that, aside from maybe some folks in the media, wondering why FDR would break this precedent. And also, you can make the argument in 1940 and 1944, you don't want to change horses in midstream. The idea that in times of national emergency, it's better to have just one leader. So to give you an idea of the impact of the 22nd Amendment, I have 2 kind of cases where, again, maybe we're nitpicking here and seeing this, but again, knowing what the Constitution says and what presidents are allowed to do as a result of this amendment, I think is quite useful. So in 1968, Lyndon Johnson was eligible to run for president because he served less than half of John F. Kennedy's term, was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. So Kennedy had already served more than half his term, which meant that Lyndon Johnson served less than 2 years. So when he was elected, he served, he served 1 term in less than 2 years. So he could have been elected again and basically served, 9 years as president of the United States. So he had the possibility of basically, being a president that served, 1 plus 4, and he could have served that 4, but, 1968, because of the very unpopularity of the Vietnam War, he chose not to run for his party's nomination. Okay, let's look at a kind of a different scenario here. Not exactly something that happened, but let's put a scenario in which a president may have left the term, may have served the term for more than a certain amount of time. President Bill Clinton was impeached by the House, but acquitted by the Senate on February 12th, 1999. Had Clinton been removed from office, Gore could have been elected one more term, since Clinton would have already served more than half of his term already. Actually, this is actually not good. Gore could have been elected, if you take a look. So had this been the case, Gore could have been elected for 2 more terms, since Clinton would have already served more than half of his term. So, you reach past this halfway point here. So this is the halfway point. So Bill Clinton had already reached that term. So Gore could have been in hypothetically similar situation as Lyndon Johnson. Now, as we know, Gore didn't win the presidency. So if Clinton had been impeached and removed from office, then Gore, had he won in the election of 2000, could have ran in 2004 again, and could have been president for a shade under 10 years. So again, this 22nd Amendment, you can be elected to president for 2 terms, or you could serve 10 years in office. So Amendment 23, let's go over this one, has to do with Washington, D.C. here. The district constituting the seat of government of the United States shall appoint in such a manner as Congress may direct a number of electors of president and vice president equal to the whole number of senators and representatives in Congress to which the district would be entitled to if it were a state, but in no event more than the least populous state. They shall be in addition to those appointed by the states, but they shall be considered for the purposes of the election of president and vice president to be electors appointed by a state, and they shall meet in the district and perform such duties as provided by the 12th article of amendment, which is to vote for the president and for the vice president. Okay, so this one's, again, fairly straightforward here. This is one of the unique aspects of federalism in the United States. So when people vote for president, they're actually voting for the electors who actually vote in the Electoral College. And the problem with residents in Washington, D.C., they're disenfranchised because they live in Washington, D.C., so they don't have the opportunity to vote for the president. And so to fix this very fundamental flaw, this idea that you live in the nation's capital, yet you're not able to vote in presidential elections, this 23rd Amendment that gave residents of D.C. the ability to vote in presidential elections was ratified on March 29, 1961. So residents of Washington, D.C. now had the right to vote in presidential elections. Okay, so in every presidential election since 1964, which was the first presidential election in which this amendment really came to effect, the electors have given their votes to the Democratic candidate, which at the time this amendment was ratified, there actually wasn't one clear indication that it would be perpetually the case, but it's turned out to be the case today. So again, at the time of its ratification, the issue was seen as a nonpartisan issue, and a bipartisan effort was made for its passage on the principle of general suffrage. The idea that it is just unfair that you're living in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., and all its residents, and you can't vote for president. So this made it so that, the state at the time with the least population, Wyoming having 3 members of the House and Senate combined, 1 House member and 2 senators. So D.C. gets the equivalent if it were a state, which is 3. Again, to give you an idea of the impact that it has in today's electoral politics, right now when it's the case that a Republican Democrat fight in the presidential election, you basically start off with a 3-point edge to the Democrats, because D.C. is generally something in which you can expect the votes being given to the Democrats. To give you an example of how extreme the case is, in 1984, Ronald Reagan won in a landslide re-election against Walter Mondale. So 1984, Ronald Reagan was hugely popular. The economy is doing well. He made a great comment in the debates that caused even Walter Mondale to laugh. When Walter Mondale was debating with Ronald Reagan, a reporter asked Ronald Reagan, who was fairly old at the time, asked if age would be an issue in the upcoming campaign. And Ronald Reagan replied that he's not going to let his opponent's youth and inexperience be an issue in the campaign. And, Walter Mondale was a fairly old gentleman, and, he laughed. And, that's kind of indicative of the entire election. The idea that, this Ronald Reagan, you had good times, and even his opponent was laughing with him, didn't bode well for Walter Mondale. And it played out. Walter Mondale lost 49 of the 50 states. So it was almost a complete sweep. There's probably not a single case where, that you can plausibly imagine a situation of such a slide of magnitude of a sweep, unless maybe Democrats sweep, because there's one particular area, Washington, D.C., that will never be won by Republicans unless something dramatic happens. So Walter Mondale only won, so Reagan lost only Minnesota, which was Mondale's home state. He was the governor of Minnesota, so it went to reason that the voters would prefer Walter Mondale, although that's not necessarily the case. In the year 2000, Al Gore's home state was Tennessee, and he lost Tennessee. And, people forget that to be the case. If Al Gore had won his home state, then he would have been president of the United States, but that's a separate issue. And also the District of Columbia with 85.38% of the votes. So imagine that in an election where there's a landslide Republican victory, the Washington, D.C. vote went to Walter Mondale by 85.38% margin, which is quite extraordinary if you think about that. Now let's call this the Michael Jordan Amendment. So, if you happen to be an NBA basketball fan, I'm more of a baseball fan myself, but I enjoy basketball as well. Well, one of the greatest basketball players of all time, Michael Jordan, number 23. So if you know anything about basketball, this might help you out. Where did Michael Jordan end his career? Well, we know that he started off in Chicago. He was Chicago Bulls. He retired. He came back to the Bulls, and then he came back from retirement yet again, and he played for the Washington Wizards. Now, where are the Wizards located in? And lo and behold, Washington, D.C. So what you can take a look here as number 23 amendment is Michael Jordan, the greatest, arguably the greatest basketball player. Number 23 goes to D.C., where he's allowed to vote. So again, that's simple mnemonic. Whereas the 22nd Amendment, that one's really easy. The 22nd Amendment, a president is limited to 2 terms in office. Okay, let's talk about the 24th Amendment. This one isn't really, it's hard to come up with a mnemonic for this one. This one, it is what it is. And so let's go over it and let's move right on here. Amendment 24, Section 1, the right of citizens of the United States to vote in any primary or other election for president or vice president, for electors for president or vice president, or for senator or representative in Congress shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state by reason of failure to pay any poll tax or other tax. This was ratified on January 23rd, 1964. Again, this was considered to be one of the surviving ways to disenfranchise black voters. So whereas the Jim Crow laws, the idea of grandfather clause, the idea of literacy tests, these were generally not used in the latter part of the 20th century, but the poll tax was seen as a way to disenfranchise black voters and also maybe poor white voters as well. And so President Kennedy, he wanted an amendment as the best way to avoid a filibuster by those considering a law against poll taxes to be unconstitutional. So there is an idea that, why make it part of the Constitution when you can just, pass a bill? But the idea is that, the filibuster might have been used by some of the Southern senators. So to kind of avoid this issue, President Kennedy decided to take the constitutional route. Now, again, if you recall U.S. history, this was ratified January 23rd, 1964. So Kennedy had already been assassinated 3 months prior in Dallas, Texas. But this was one of the things that did pass. Again, in today's day and age, you're not going to have elections where people are going to have to pay. In fact, this is considered one of the good things about American democracy. The idea that it doesn't matter how rich or poor you are, each individual has the same opportunity to vote and impact the election. So the 25th Amendment, this one's kind of fun. So this is going to take a little bit longer. So Section 1, in the case of the removal of the president from office or his death or resignation, the vice president shall become president, not act as president, which was kind of ambiguous phrasing, but actually become the president. Section 2, whenever there is a vacancy in the office of vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take office upon confirmation by majority vote of both houses of Congress. This has been invoked, or this has been used, since its adoption. And then Section 3, whenever the president transmits to the president pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives has written, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives his written declaration that he is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, and until he transmits to them a written declaration to the contrary, such powers and duties shall be discharged by the vice president as acting president. So basically, if the president says he's incapacitated, then the vice president will basically, on a provisional or on a temporary basis, become president of the United States or acting president of the United States. Section 4, this one is the one that's the subject of a lot of movies here. Whenever the vice president and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments or of such other body as Congress may by law provide, transmit to the president pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives their written declaration that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, again, for whatever reason, the vice president shall immediately assume the powers and duties of the office as acting president. So this one is kind of interesting. If maybe the president is incapacitated and doesn't want to admit to it for whatever reason, or circumstances, let's say he was kidnapped and unable to discharge the duties of president, there's a provision where the vice president and the majority members of the cabinet can sign a declaration, and now the vice president would become president. This was ratified on February 23rd, 1967 here. So this amendment, again, in its totality, covers a lot of different issues that kind of cleared up a lot of ambiguous issues that dealt with the transfers of power between the vice president and the president. So this amendment, it made unambiguous that the vice president became president rather than simply assume the president's duties. So again, might be a very subtle change, but there is a difference between being the president of the United States or being the acting president of the United States. So even if it was an informal change, that is not necessarily good enough. So the Constitution made it such that the vice president became president of the United States. Again, a lot of this had to do with President Kennedy's assassination on November 22nd, 1963. Lyndon Johnson became the acting president or the president, and there's no dispute, but to make that change formal and established, that was necessary, and that's something that the 25th Amendment provided. So Amendment 25 here. John Tyler, who became president upon the death of William Henry Harrison, he refused to sign any document stating him as acting president, and basically established the Tyler president, where he became the president. But again, it's not because it was established in the Constitution, but because the wording was vague, and so John Tyler, just became the president that said that he was the president, and basically he wasn't challenged about the legitimacy of the presidency. When Woodrow Wilson suffered a massive stroke on October 2nd, 1919, many refer to Edith Wilson as our first female president. So for, a string of, 17 months, Woodrow Wilson, kind of hidden from the public knowledge, he, in today's day and age, it would be unfathomable to have a president that incapacitated, and yet he was still president of the United States. So, something like that happening really called into question the wisdom of not really having a process by which the president is no longer president. Had the 25th Amendment been in place during that time, it's probably clear, if the vice president was made aware of the situation, that there would be an attempt to have the president relinquish his powers as president, but it wasn't at the time, and a lot of historians argued that we had for a brief period of time our first female president really running the country. Everything went through Edith Wilson. So again, previous presidents who had taken over because of a previous president's death had no vice president, including Lyndon Johnson, and that became a very serious issue. Lyndon Johnson wasn't the healthiest man, and if he had died, there would have been an issue with the presidential succession, you having the House of Representatives. So not having a vice president posed a very serious issue, especially in this nuclear age. Again, Truman served nearly all 4 years of FDR's term without a vice president as well. So again, that was an issue. If Truman had died, then you have an issue of an unelected. You have an unelected president. Actually, you have the Speaker of the House becoming the vice president, but you leave that position fairly vulnerable. Gerald Ford was actually the only president to have served to never have been elected as president or vice president. Spiro Agnew, who's Richard Nixon's vice president, resigned because of legal issues, and so Gerald Ford was selected as the vice president. Now, what's kind of interesting is that a lot of people knew at the time that there's a chance that Nixon was actually selecting the next president of the United States, because Nixon became embroiled in the Watergate scandal. Again, at that time, it wasn't clear that he would resign from office. But then Gerald Ford ascended to the presidency, and then he, in turn, nominated Nelson Rockefeller to be his vice president. Now, Section 4, again, I think that's the most fun section of the amendment, has never been invoked in real life, but I've actually seen it twice in movies. I'm sure it's been invoked in several other movies. But in 24, crisis situation where the vice president and the majority of cabinet, they gathered together and they basically stabbed the back of the vice president in a very close vote, and the president is taken to custody and arrested. 24 is a TV series starring Kiefer Sutherland as Jack Bauer, and also Air Force One. This is a movie starring Woody Harrelson, where Harrison Ford plays the president of the United States, and he's kidnapped. And it's unclear whether or not he has the capacity to serve as president of the United States. So, majority of cabinet and the vice president, played by Glenn Close, who would have acted as female president. She's on the verge of signing a declaration giving her the rights to the presidency, but in the end, she rips it up and trusts in the character played by Harrison Ford. But again, nothing in real life has really been invoked where the president maybe is in a compromised position or is unwilling to relinquish the powers of the presidency. But it makes for a great movie or TV subplot. Okay, so Amendment 26. Let's talk about Amendment 26 here. This one's very straightforward. There's not a whole lot of complications. It's very easy to understand. The right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age. This one really had to do with the Vietnam War here. So the Vietnam War necessitated the passage of this amendment. Okay, very simple principle that really resonated, I'm sure, with Congress in the States here. If you're old enough to fight and die in a war, you should have the right to vote. So this was a very compelling argument that, a lot of 18-year-olds were being sent to fight off in Vietnam, and yet they didn't have the right to vote for the politicians that sent them off to fight in the war in Vietnam. So this amendment pretty much had unanimous support. Some states had already permitted those between 18 to 21 to vote, and a federal law was passed mandating states to allow 18-year-olds to vote. But, this was struck down as unconstitutional. The idea that, what right did the federal government have to dictate to the states that, so-and-so had to be 18 or that could be 18 years old. You required them to vote. So there's nothing in the Constitution that allowed for that. So, hence, the 26th Amendment to the Constitution really rectified this situation. And again, it was not a controversial amendment. This passed within 4 months of Congress passing it and the states ratifying it, which is the shortest time of any amendment in getting passed. So this was an amendment that clearly the American people wanted, and it made a whole lot of sense. Now, what's kind of interesting is that the political ramifications of this had little impact, because 18-year-olds didn't really vote any differently than any other sector of the population, at least at that time of its ratification. Okay, and the final amendment, this one is really a testament to the idea of an individual, taking to the limits of what could be done. So this is 27th Amendment is a good example of an individual seeing an issue and taking part in our political process. So this is it's kind of a feel-good story if you take a look at what is being said here. There's no section; it's just one entire sentence that was added as our final amendment to the Constitution as of now. No law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. So this is the idea that if senators and representatives vote for themselves a pay raise, well, that pay raise won't take into effect until after the representative or senator has been reelected. So, is this going to have like a huge impact? Probably not, but it's largely a symbolic message that, if you're going to vote for a pay raise, you're going to have to face the wrath of the voters who are going to have records to the fact that you voted for this pay raise. Now, again, this timeline here is going to be a lot more interesting than some of the other timelines. So the dates here are actually pretty important. This passed Congress on September 25th, 1789. That's not a typo, 1789. And it was officially certified on May 18th, 1992. So over 200 years passed, nearly 203 years between the passage of the amendment in Congress and its ratification in the Senate. This was actually part of the original 12 amendments to the Bill of Rights, but this amendment wasn't ratified, but it was passed by Congress. And again, very interesting story. Gregory Watson was an undergraduate student at the University of Texas, Austin. He wrote a paper, again, as an undergraduate student, so not as a graduate or PhD student, but a college student. He wrote a paper on how Madison's amendment should be passed, as there was no deadline specified as to when the amendment had to be ratified. So if you, again, look back at the text of the amendment, no law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. Some amendments have like a section 2 where it says, if not ratified within 7 years, this amendment is void, something along those lines. Well, this amendment had no such stipulation. And so basically he created this letter writing campaign, and the state of Maine actually took hold of that. Another state had actually picked it up and ratified it, but Watson actually wrote this letter campaign to Maine and other states until 38 states, which represents 76%, which is greater than 3/4 majority required. And finally, it was ratified on May 18th, 1992. So it took one individual to kind of see this through, and state legislatures actually passed this as part of our Constitution. Now, here's the funny part here, is that Watson received a C on the paper because his thesis was seen as being too unrealistic. So I'm sure the professor who graded that essay is probably questioning her grading methods, let's just say, to have passed the amendments to the Constitution as a result of a paper, and you get a C. I'm sure that's probably the most satisfying C that Mr. Gregory Watson has ever received in his life. Now, the reality is that congressmen, congresswomen, they actually do get pay raises, but it's kind of tricky how they get the pay raises. They don't officially get pay raises. There are automatic cost of living adjustments, or COLA raises, that take place automatically in practice. So it's already built in. Congressmen don't actually vote on the pay raise. It's basically automatically included in raises and pay. But at least the 27th Amendment prohibits a congressman from formally voting to increase his pay and reaping its benefits in the current election cycle. Example number 1. Let's take a look at this question. What is the maximum amount of years a president is capable of serving under the provisions of the 25th Amendment? So we know, let's list some basic facts. 1 term equals 4 years. Okay, so a president under the 22nd Amendment, so again, 22nd Amendment is a president can serve 2 terms. So 2 terms, or 2 terms plus under half. So if you want to go into the minute seconds, 1.9999 or 2, under half 1 term. So if you look at that, the maximum is going to be 4 years times 2 plus 2 equals 10. So this is probably the only math that we're gonna do in AP Government here. So while this may be the tempting answer right here, so 4 is clearly wrong, 6 is wrong, 12 is wrong. This is the answer that you might get a little bit tricked if you don't know the nuances of the 22nd Amendment, but it could actually be 10 years, absolutely. So let's go ahead and look at question number 2, example number 2. Which amendment to the Constitution took the shortest amount of time to have been ratified by the states here? Let's take a look at this here. This 23rd Amendment was the D.C. Amendment, the Michael Jordan, because Michael Jordan wore number 23, and he retired in Washington, D.C. The 24th Amendment, I don't have really a mnemonic for this, so the elimination of the poll tax. Okay. The 25th Amendment dealt with presidential succession or presidential disability. And the 26th Amendment lowered voting age to what? To 18. And then 27th Amendment has to do with congressional pay. And so, which one took the shortest amount of time? Well, if you had no idea the answer to this question, again, very unlikely a question this specific is going to be on the AP exam. But again, implicit in being able to answer certain questions comes with the knowledge that you know what these amendments are. The amendment that really was the least controversial was probably lowering the voting age to 18. The whole Vietnam War, basically, again, that argument of if you're old enough to fight and die, then you should be old enough to vote for these politicians that send you off to unconstitutional wars that some may suggest. So the answer is the 26th Amendment. So it took 4 months, which is a really a quick, short turnover in terms of between the 2/3 passed by Congress. So by both houses of Congress, 2/3 agreed to the amendment, passed the amendment, and then 3/4 of the states ratify, which currently would be 38 of the 50 states, which would be 76% theoretically, but 37 is only 74%, which is less than the 3/4 required. Okay, now kind of a follow-up question here. Which amendment to the Constitution took the longest amount of time to have been ratified by the states? Is it the 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th, or 27th Amendment? Again, we just answered the previous. It's not the 26th Amendment. That was the shortest amount of time. Now, again, what's kind of interesting, the 23rd is the D.C. Amendment. Again, probably not. 24th, the poll tax. Nothing compelling about that. 25th Amendment, presidential disability. The answer by far is the 27th Amendment. Again, it took 203 years from 1789, the original passage of the Bill of Rights, all the way to 1992. And again, it took a college student to pick up this case, that there was no time requirement. And so it took 203 years for this amendment to pass. So quite a long time, but it kind of shows you that our Constitution is a system of laws, and if there's no laws requiring a certain time passage, then there's no laws. There's no time requirement. Otherwise, it would have been built into the amendment. So it goes to show the wording of how a law or amendment is put into place, has huge ramifications on the passage and its interpretation. Okay, example number 4 here. Which president established the 2-term tradition? Was it George Washington? Okay, so he served 2 terms, and he did establish the precedent, so it's possible that he is. Thomas Jefferson, he established this precedent. He followed George Washington, and he's a possible answer here, so we're not going to cross him out. John Tyler, the Tyler precedent. The Tyler precedent was a different type of precedent. He set the idea that he is no acting president. So he legitimated the idea of a vice president taking over in the case of a death. But that is incorrect because he didn't establish, he only served 1 term or less than 1 term. So he did not do that. Theodore Roosevelt, again, he was a bull moose. So he unsuccessfully ran as a third-party candidate, which when we discuss political parties and third parties, Theodore Roosevelt and the election of 1912, a very interesting case study on the impact of third parties. But again, he didn't really have much regard for that 2-term tradition. Maybe initially he did. He stepped aside. Maybe he was pressured to follow this 2-term tradition, but he certainly didn't establish it. And FDR, absolutely not. He was elected in the following years in 1932, 1936, 1940, 1944. So he was elected 4 times. So he definitely did not establish a 2-term president. So it's between George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Again, it's kind of a close call, and you know what? You could really go either way on this, but again, personally, I would have to eliminate George Washington because it's more of Thomas Jefferson that established the 2-term tradition. George Washington may have started it, but it's Thomas Jefferson that established this 2-term tradition. So we'll go with that. And the final question is the following here. Which of the following amendments does not deal with changing the presidential selection process? So this one really has to do with the presidency and the amendments. So having a solid understanding of these, of how they work together is going to be helpful in answering the question. Well, the 12th Amendment. What is the 12th Amendment to the Constitution? That deals with 1 and 2, number 1 and 2. So the number 1, president, and number 2, VP selection. So that's absolutely has to do with the presidential selection process. So 12 is incorrect. 22nd Amendment. So 2 terms, president. That has to do with presidential selection process as well. So that's incorrect. My favorite mnemonic here. This is a Michael Jordan is allowed to vote for the president, number 23, going to DC. So the 23rd Amendment is incorrect. 24th Amendment has to deal with the poll tax. Poll tax is eliminated here. Poll tax is eliminated. So this one is kind of tricky here because this does, while it doesn't set the terms or add a different election, but the poll tax actually does deal with the presidential election process as well. So this is incorrect here. And the 25th Amendment deals with presidential disability here. So this has to do with, actually, it does have to do with the presidential selection process, because if the president resigns, then the VP becomes president, and the VP selects a new VP, or if the VP resigns, the president selects a new VP. And this actually happened in Richard Nixon's presidency, where he resigned, and he selected a new vice president, and he became vice president. Gerald Ford selected Nelson Rockefeller. So this is actually incorrect as well. So all of these questions here are actually incorrect because they do deal with the presidential selection process. So the answer to this question is F, none of the above. So this is kind of a trick question here. None of the above. Now, obviously, on the AP exam, you're not going to have all these answer choices being correct, but I just want you to understand that when you're dealing with these questions, kind of have a clear understanding of what's going on here. Please, under no circumstances on the AP exam, create an F bubble and create an F bubble. I actually had a student one time on a government test. Apparently she didn't like one of the answers that I had, and on a Scantron actually created an F bubble. So you had an A, you had an A right here, you had a B, you had a C, you had a D, and you had an E. And the student didn't like any of the answer choices, so she created her own F bubble and created basically what I did right here. None of the above. So please don't do that on the AP exam. Try to choose the best answer that you have. Thank you for watching educator.com.